Institute for Constitutional Government.
Well, welcome everybody to the Heritage Foundation. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Lee Edwards Lecture in Conservative Leadership. The man we honor tonight, Dr. Lee Edwards, was the long-serving Distinguished Fellow in Conservative Thought in the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies here at Heritage. For most of that time, the president of Heritage was Lee's close friend, Dr. Edwin Fulner, who is with us here tonight. Thanks so much for being here, Ed. During his time at Heritage, Lee wrote most of his 25 books about the leading individuals and institutions of the modern conservative movement, including biographies of President Reagan, Barry Goldwater, William F. Buckley, and our very own Ed Meese, who, to honor Lee, has also joined us here this evening. In addition to the many books that he wrote, Lee served as a distinguished lecturer at Catholic University of America, where he taught politics for over 30 years, and was also the co-founder of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Unfortunately, Lee is unable to be with us tonight because of some health issues, but he sent me a statement which I'd like to read to you now. My dear friends, I am so sorry I cannot join you this evening for the inaugural lecture in my name here at this institution that I so cherish. My health does not permit it. Nevertheless, I'm so very pleased that my good friend Peter Robinson is giving the first Lee Edwards Lecture in Conservative Leadership. His topic this evening, speaking about my favorite president, is as important as ever. We must learn the lessons of this great statesman. I understand some of you went to the Victims of Communism Museum earlier today. Thank you for that. I hope everyone will visit the museum and send others to learn about the history of communism so we will prevent the revival of such totalitarian evil in this world. And regarding the museum and Victims of Communism, I must thank all of my many friends at Heritage and elsewhere whose support made this long project and so many of the little labors of love possible. I would like to thank my family, in particular, my beloved wife, Anne, who is no longer with us, and my two wonderful daughters, my dear Catherine, and especially this evening, Elizabeth, who, as its founding director, is the one who created our Jewel Box Museum and wrote every word on its walls, and as a true scholar will continue to carry on this important work and so much more in her own writings and as the chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I am so proud of all of you. Thank you, and may God bless you as he has blessed me. Lee Edwards. Lee, we know that you are with us in spirit. We miss you, and we wish you a full and complete recovery. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the man who will deliver this lecture on how Reagan won the Cold War. A graduate of Dartmouth College, Oxford University, and Stanford Business School, Peter Robinson is the Murdoch Distinguished Policy Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he writes about business and politics, edits Hoover's quarterly journal, The Hoover Digest, and hosts the popular podcast, Uncommon Knowledge. Peter spent 6 years in the White House, serving as chief speechwriter for Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush for 2 of those years, and the remainder as special assistant and speechwriter to President Ronald Reagan. Most significantly, for purposes of Peter's lecture tonight, he wrote the historic, iconic really, speech that Reagan delivered at the Berlin Wall 37 years ago yesterday, calling on General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Peter's articles have appeared in many prestigious journals, and he is the author of 3 books, including How Ronald Reagan Changed My Life. Please join me in welcoming Peter Robinson.
our friend Bruce Weinrod was a researcher on a book some years ago, and he gave me a copy of this book yesterday, Reagan, A Political Biography by Lee Edwards. The cover is falling off because this is an original book, 1967. Let me read to you from the preface. This is Lee. I first met Ronald Reagan in October 1965. I was skeptical at first, but in the end, I decided that here was no puppet at the end of a string, but a highly intelligent, dedicated man with an intriguing personality and philosophy. This lecture series that I'm fortunate enough to inaugurate, the Lee Edwards Lecture in Conservative Leadership, is well named because Lee knew conservative leadership when he saw it. But it's good to be with you. Actually, I had a specific job in the Reagan speechwriting shop. I was the well man. Somebody would write the speech, it would go to the president, he would make his changes, and then it would come back to me, and I would go through the text, and here and there I would insert, well. There are a number of people, if I start saying hello, but there are a couple of people I simply must recognize. Ed Fulner. Ed founded this institution in 1973. Yesterday, by the way, let's establish something. Yesterday was the 37th anniversary of the Berlin Wall speech. If you are 37 years or older, no, let's put it the other way around. If you are 37 years or younger, put your hand up. All right. I will talk very slowly. But the point of mentioning this is that in 1973, founding an institution such as this was an act of faith and courage, and things got worse for some years before they began to get better. And then Attorney General Meese, Chief of Staff to Governor Reagan, Counselor to President Reagan, Attorney General of the United States, and throughout his entire career, those of you who are under 37 will not remember this, but there was a time in the Reagan period when Ed, as Attorney General, was vilified. It was an early example of our politics turning really sour and bitter and mean. And you will not discover in Ed Meese any scar tissue, no unhappiness, no unpleasantness. It is as if he's done nothing all his life but farm corn in Iowa. And yet, look at all he has done. So there's a phrase we use it too loosely, but even under strict construction, and this is a man who insists on strict construction after all, even under the strictest construction, Ed Meese is a great American. John Malcolm described Lee Edwards, who is a historic figure in his own right. But since he's described this to you, I have one of his many books here. But let me tell you what you might not know about Lee. Not only is he a brilliant writer, in fact, he's written so many books so beautifully that those of us who are also writers have to hate him for that. But he's also quite saintly. When I lived in Washington, I attended the same church as Lee, the Little Flower out in Bethesda. And every Sunday, Lee would sing in the choir. And standing next to him every Sunday was Cokie Roberts. Now, Cokie Roberts was the product of a major liberal family, and she was a star at National Public Radio. And I knew what Lee thought of National Public Radio. I knew that. And yet Sunday after Sunday, I would study him for some sign of irritation, and he would just sing with the face of an angel. How did Ronald Reagan win the Cold War? Let me tell you the story. I will get to that, but let me do so by telling you the story of a speech. In April 1987, I was assigned to write a speech. I was 29. Anybody 29 or younger here today? Oh my goodness. All right. Actually, I won't talk slowly. I'll talk fast because I think I'm about to spoil. I'm aging so quickly here. I was 29. The president was going to be speaking, was going to be flying to Venice to participate in an economic summit. And it turned out that the city of Berlin was celebrating a major anniversary, a 750th anniversary. Queen Elizabeth II had already visited, and more to the point, Mikhail Gorbachev was planning a visit. The Kohl government of West Germany requested that President Reagan visit West Berlin to offset the visit that Gorbachev would be making to East Berlin. Here's what I was told, the direction I received from the senior staff. The president would stand in front of the Berlin Wall. He would have an audience of about 40,000 people. He ought to talk for about half an hour. And given the setting, he ought to address foreign policy. And with that, the first thing I did was hole up in my office for a week or so to read everything I could about Berlin. And since we have some people here who are under 37, let me review for you the situation that I was studying in my office. Could I have the first slide? They'll come to in a moment. Could I have the first slide? It's there. Okay, all right. So, for those of you under 37, after the Second World War, Germany was divided into a democratic West Germany and communist East Germany, and Berlin, the capital, was itself divided into West Berlin, which was democratic, that's that little blob of blue in the middle of the red, and communist East Berlin. If you were an East German, you would have noticed very quickly after the end of the war that West Germany was beginning to recover economically, that West Germany was democratic. East Germany was solidly communist, and West Germany began to take off. So in the early years, if you were an East German and you wanted to get out of East Germany and go to West Germany, what did you do? You went to Berlin and you crossed the street. You could simply escape to the West by crossing the street into West Berlin, and from there, if you wanted to do so, you could get on a train and take a train across East German territory to West Germany itself. By 1960, some 3.5 million East Germans had done just that, using West Berlin to escape or leave, let's put it that way, for West Germany. That amounted to almost 1/5 of the population of East Germany. So the communists had a problem. How could they stop this? In August 1961, the East German government decided to stop it by putting up a physical barrier. Could I have the next slide, please? First, this barrier took the form of barbed wire. Next slide. Then they replaced the barbed wire with cinder blocks. The next slide, please. And eventually, they replaced the cinder blocks with a real wall. Concrete slabs, 13 feet high, surrounding West Berlin. Could I have the next slide, please? And by the 1980s, the wall had taken its final form. In West Berlin, people were free. They sprayed the wall with graffiti. They objected to it, they decorated it. On the other side, as you can see in the slide, there was a killing zone. And it was a literal killing zone. Many people were killed in that zone attempting to escape from east to west. All right, that was the background that was borne in on me as I holed up in my office and did research. I then flew to West Berlin as part of the American pre-advance team. This involved people from the press office who were going to make sure that the president's camera angles were correct, people from the Secret Service who would liaise with the West German police and so forth. And I had a day in West Berlin to gather material. I made 4 stops. First was to the site where the president would speak, and I climbed an observation platform at the Berlin Wall. I was, of course, inside West Germany. I looked over the wall into East Germany. And this is in some ways almost impossible to convey, but the most important thing for me to convey, particularly to those of you who have no memory of this. when you stood at that observation platform, behind you in West Berlin, you had a city that felt normal. Recent model cars, lots of Mercedes-Benzes, it was Germany, people who were well-dressed, neon lights on the storefronts, traffic, people going places on the sidewalks. And when you peered over the wall into East Germany, silence, very little movement. I stood there for 10 minutes and counted 2 cars. I saw only a few knots of pedestrians. It seemed colorless. In fact, when they made the movie, what was it called? Goodbye Lenin, about the director, I read an interview afterwards in which the director said that to recreate the feel of East Berlin, they had to use a filter that filtered out color to make it look to the people who had lived there, to make it look real. The colorlessness, the silence, far more soldiers than pedestrians. So, as I say, I was 29 when all this started. I climbed down from that observation platform in serious trouble. I couldn't imagine what material I could gather that would enable me to write something for the president that would be equal to that place. Next, I went to the ranking American diplomat in Berlin, a man called John Kornblum, and he gave me a lot of ideas about what Ronald Reagan should not say. Don't have him sound like an anti-communist cowboy. We're deep inside East Germany. These people understand the subtlety and nuance required in East-West relations, and don't have him make a big deal about the wall. They've all gotten used to it by now. Third, I was given a ride in a US Army helicopter over the wall. We flew all the way around West Berlin, staying just inside West Berlin airspace. And although from inside West Berlin, the wall looked bad enough, from the air, it looked even worse because you could see what was on the other side. Guard towers, dog runs. There were large areas of very carefully raked gravel. So I used the walkie-talkie to ask the pilot about that. What was that for? And the pilot explained that that gravel was for the sake of the East German soldiers. If any young man decided that he was going to let a member of his family escape in the middle of the night, he would know that he would have to explain the footprints in the gravel to his commander. So I remember thinking as we were flying around, they have thought of everything. Final stop for me that day. I got in a taxi in downtown West Berlin, departed from the American Party, and went off to a residential suburb of West Berlin for a dinner party. About a dozen or 15 West Berliners. I had not met anyone there, including the host and hostess, but the host and hostess and I had common friends back in Washington. So they had put on a dinner party just so I could meet some ordinary West Berliners. And there was a physician there, a couple of, an economist who taught at the Freistadt University in Berlin, a couple of students, a couple of homemakers, just a kind of grab bag of people, all of whom spoke English. That was what they had in common, so that I could meet West Berliners. Well, we chatted a little while, and then I thought I absolutely have to ask. So I said, I was told by the American diplomat that you've all gotten used to the wall by now. Is that true? Silence. I thought, oh, I've committed exactly the kind of gaffe that the diplomat wants to make sure the president doesn't commit. But then they began to look at each other, and finally one man raised his arm, and he pointed, and he said, my sister lives just a few kilometers in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about that wall? And then they went around the room, each person telling me a story about the wall. I can remember one man was a physician who walked to his office by the same route each day, and his route took him under a guard tower. And he said, there's a young man up in that guard tower with a rifle over his shoulder who peers down at me with binoculars each morning. We share the same history, we speak the same language, but one of us is a zookeeper and the other is an animal, and I have never been able to decide which was which. And then our hostess, a woman called Ingeborg Eltz, lovely woman who just died a couple of years ago, but our hostess became angry. And she said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk, this glasnost, this perestroika. He can prove it by coming here and getting rid of that wall. Could I have the next slide, please? And I put that went right into my notebook. You can't see it terribly well, but it's note number 17. If the Russians are willing to open up, then the wall must go. So that, at that very moment, I thought, if the president were here, he would have responded to that remark, the simplicity, the decency, the power of that remark. Back in Washington, I worked on a speech for a week. I told my boss, Tony Dolan, the chief speechwriter, that I wanted to build a speech around the call to tear down the wall. He trotted me over to the West Wing to discuss this with Tommy Griscom, who was the director of communications. Tommy was the oldest of us. Tommy might have been 33 or 34 at that stage. And Tommy understood. And they left me alone for a week to draft. And I did some terrible writing. I can still remember at the end of the week, Tony, the old executive office building, what is it called now? The Eisenhower office building, has marble floors. And Tony wore cowboy boots. I can still remember hearing his boots click, click, click down the hall. And he took my draft and threw it on my desk and said, "It's no good." I said, "Tony, what's no good? Give me a paragraph that I need to fit." And he said, no. The whole thing, it's no good. And I was very conscious that the audience at home on television would be American, but the audience in front of the president would be German. So I'd given him the line about tearing down, I said, "Herr Gorbachev, machen Sie dieser Tor auf." Open the Brandenburg Gate. And Tony said, "Peter, when your client is the President of the United States, give him the big lines in English." So I went home and slept up, and this next week came back to the office and produced a better draft. Friday, May 15th, it's long enough ago now, Ed, that I can tell this story. There's a piece of this story that's embarrassed me for a long time, but I'm about to tell you. Particularly those of you who are under 37, it shows there are often spaces in Washington through which a young person can move. Tony Dolan and Tommy Griscom and I had the feeling that this call to tear down the wall might cause a little bit of ruffle among the staff. And it was the rule, a very serious rule in the Reagan White House, that before a speech went to the president, it went out to staffing. Staffing first, then the president. In this case, all the other speechwriters, there were 6 of us on the staff at that point, the president had quite a lot of remarks connected with his visit to Italy. He was going to see the Pope. That was a set of remarks. Calling the president of Italy, that was a set of remarks. Several sets of remarks at the Venice. Everybody hurried to get the remarks done at once, producing a pile of speeches, including my speech. And on Friday afternoon, May 15th, Friday afternoon, we waited for the sound of the helicopter landing on the South Lawn to take the president to Camp David. And then the speechwriter's chief secretary, Nancy Roberts, took this pile over to the diplomatic reception room in the residence, where the staff secretary was waiting. Now, it's important to note that this is not too long after, this is a matter of weeks after, Don Regan resigned as chief of staff and Howard Baker came on as chief of staff, bringing Tommy Griscom, the communications director, and the staff secretary. The staff secretary was relatively new to his job and wasn't quite sure what he was doing. He knew speeches were supposed to go to staffing. He suspected the speechwriters might be up, but Nancy Roberts, the secretary, said, "Well, look, we just thought we should give him a head start. There's so much material here. Why don't you give it to him to look it over at Camp David?" They're talking about this back and forth. The staff secretary thinks there's something, and then Ronald Reagan walks into the room and says, "Oh, you have some homework for me?" Reaches the material, takes it, and off he goes to the helicopter. So the president saw the draft before it went out to staffing. And the following Monday, next slide, please. There we have it. We talked about speeches that he was going to deliver when he saw the Pope and in Venice. And there, that startlingly handsome extremely young man in the middle sofa who's facing you with a red tie. That's me. Then we got to the speech for Berlin. And, and the president said, oh, well, that was a good draft. And we always wanted more from him. General Meese will know this. We always wanted more from him. All of us did. And we would go into these meetings with the president. If you had time, you might ask him a question. So we'd think through what question could we ask to get him talking. And I said, Mr. President, I learned in West Berlin that people will be able to hear your remarks on the other side of the wall, the communist side of the wall. And depending on weather conditions, they may be able to pick up your remarks by radio as far east as Moscow. Is there anything particular you'd like to say to people on the communist side of the wall? And the president, I can still, this is like a movie reel in my mind. The president thought for a moment, and he said, well, there's that passage about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down. And I, because I was an idiot, was disappointed. I thought I wanted some fresh material. All right. Then the speech went out to staffing. And for 3 weeks, from the moment it went out to staffing until the president delivered it, the State Department and the National Security Council tried to suppress it. They began submitting one draft after another on different pretexts, but always omitting the call to tear down the wall. May I have the next slide, please? I promise you I'm not making this up. There's document after document in the Reagan Library showing NSC Xing out the call to tear down the wall. Now, their problem was that Ronald Reagan had said in front of witnesses that he especially wanted to deliver that passage about tearing down the wall. And nobody seemed to want to argue with him about it. So they decided to argue with the speechwriters. And I got called in. Each time the state or the NSC submitted a new draft, Tommy Griscom would call me into his office, have me read the new draft, and then say, okay, have they persuaded you? Of course, they never had. And I went over there to the West Wing one time, and Colin Powell was there waiting. And Colin Powell, a decorated general in the Army, knew how to handle an insubordinate young man, and he just shouted at me. And I have to tell you, I don't know what came over me. I shouted right back. I don't know which one of us was more surprised, but Colin Powell just got up and walked out. So a day or two before the president left for Europe, here's what the NSC thought of things. Next slide, please. There we are. There's a memorandum to Colin Powell. The Brandenburg Gate speech is better than before. We had given them we'd made a few concessions, we speechwriters. But the staff is still unanimous that it's a mediocre speech and a missed opportunity. That was 37 years ago. Have I gotten over it? Those sons of bitches. So I was too junior. As I say, I was only, by this stage I'd had a birthday. I was 30 as this memo's, but I was still too junior to be part of the traveling party. So I'm stuck in the White House wondering what's happening. The president leaves. Tony Dolan, the chief speechwriter, is with him. And Tony was able to make one. In those days, as my friend Philip will recall, in those days it was very difficult to make a secure call from Europe to the United States. Tony made one call to me and he said, Peter, they're still at it. They're still at it. Draft after draft. Ken Duberstein, who was deputy chief of staff, told me that George Shultz approached him in Europe and objected to the speech again. Shultz had already objected to Howard Baker. Howard Baker, the chief of staff, said it sounded unprecedented. Everybody was against this thing. And Duberstein sat down with the president in the garden of some Italian palazzo and told him about the arguments from the State Department. It was naive, it would raise false expectations, it might put Kohl in a difficult position, it might put Gorbachev in a difficult position, and then he had the president reread that central passage, and then they talked about it. And Ken said there was a moment when that twinkle came on in Reagan's face, and he said, now, I'm the president, aren't I? Yes, Mr. President, we're clear about that much. So I get to decide whether that line stays in? Yes, sir, it is your decision. Well then, it stays in. The morning the president left Venice, the traveling party left Venice to fly to Berlin to deliver that speech, the State Department sent another alternative draft to Air Force One. The fax machine, remember old fax machine, started clacking away in the back of the plane. Tony Dolan told me about this. And in the limousine, on the way to the wall to deliver the speech, the president told Ken Duberstein he intended to deliver it as written. And then the president said, he slapped Duberstein on the knee and said, "The boys at State are going to kill me for this, but it's the right thing to do." The video clip, please.
We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I was watching that on my little Sony Trinitron, you won't remember what Trinitron. I was watching this on a little television about this big in my bachelor apartment at home. And because I am such a noble spirit, my thought was not, what a magnificent moment for human liberty. My thought was, we beat those bastards at State. By the way, Tommy Griscom, again, Tommy was in his 30s at this stage, and he said, immediately after the president spoke, as the American Party was breaking up, there were one or two other events in Berlin. Everybody had to get back in the motorcade on to the next event. Tommy spotted George Shultz. General Meese knew George Shultz. Is there anybody here who remembers George Shultz well? He's all right, good. George Shultz was one formidable man. And those blue eyes, I am convinced those blue eyes could burn holes in titanium. And Tommy saw George Shultz scanning the crowd as if he were looking for someone. And then Shultz saw Tommy and started walking toward him. And Tommy thought, oh my goodness, I am about to be dressed down by the Secretary of State in a foreign country. And Shultz got to him and looked at him for a moment and said, you were right. And then left. The autumn of 1989, just over 2 years after President Reagan spoke, on October 7th, 1989, East Germany celebrated its 40th anniversary of the founding of the communist state. Mikhail Gorbachev visits and tells the East German Politburo they're on their own. He's going to keep the Red Army in the barracks if there's any trouble. Protests begin. There's a pattern of prayer groups at Lutheran churches throughout East Germany and small protests after prayer meetings. the police do not put the protests down. The protests grow, and in the course of a month, they grow from scattered small protests to hundreds of thousands of people in the capital of East Berlin. On the night of November 9th, the East German Politburo meets an emergency session throughout the night, and one member of the Politburo excuses himself to inform the press about what they're deciding, and he mentions that among another number of actions, they've decided to ease certain travel restrictions, including travel restrictions concerning the wall. Now, we now know that he was mistaken. He misread, he misunderstood what was happening. The press said, when does this take effect? And he hadn't thought that through, but he said immediately. With the result, this was being broadcast by radio and television live across Germany, with the result that within a matter of moments, cars, bicycles, people on foot begin crowding at the wall. None of the soldiers there has received any briefing. All of this is completely new to them. And the soldiers realize they have a decision. They're going to have to shoot people or open the gate, open the checkpoints, and they opened the checkpoints. So could I have the next slide, please? So 2 years and 5 months after Ronald Reagan delivered the speech, the Berlin Wall did begin to be torn down. How did Ronald Reagan do it? I'm finally working my way back to how did Ronald Reagan win the Cold War? Could I have the next slide, please? The first point to make here, I think, is that it was Ronald Reagan who did it. You will see the speechwriter's name up on the top corner. And that's about as much credit as I deserve. Because you have to believe me when I told you, I was in Berlin listening for material he would like. By this point, I'd been in the White House for 5 years. I knew what he sounded like. I knew his positions on the policies. And why is this? This is because Ronald Reagan has been giving speeches and writing for decades before he became president, which leads me to the answer that I would like to offer. Of course, there are many answers to how he did it. His faith, his determination, his simple ability to connect with people. But my answer, the answer I'd like to propose, is something that's often overlooked. And that is, as General Meese will confirm, that Ronald Reagan read widely and wrote constantly. He was never without a book, and he was seldom without a pen. In fact, I visited him, what would this have been? I visited him in 1989, just months after he had left office. I visited him in his post-presidential complex down in Los Angeles. And as I walked in, he looked up and he said, "Oh, well, now that I'm out of office, I have to write my speeches myself." He was back at it. It's worth noting, I think, that set him apart from many politicians. George H.W. Bush, whom I knew and revered. George H.W. Bush had a big family. He had enormous connections in Texas, and he wrote notes to people. That was a kind of typical politician's approach to the way he did his job. It was by building networks. Richard Nixon was a party man. He knew the Republican Party in great detail. FDR had a famous party trick, which was that after dinner, he would unroll a map of the United States and have a guest pick up a pencil and draw a line across the United States, and FDR would name the Democratic Party chairman in every county through which that line passed. Ronald Reagan was not like that. Ronald Reagan had ideas, and he had words. He was, in the strict sense of the word, he was an intellectual. He weighed evidence, he considered arguments, he tried out his thoughts on audiences, and when he reached a conclusion, he considered himself bound by it. Which brings me to, I'll close now, to the relief of all of you who are under 37, which brings me to the work of the Heritage Foundation. If we see a speech like this, we look at YouTube, we see a wonderful moment. But behind that moment lies years of work, analysis, the hard work of argumentation, of forming arguments, of finding out what persuades people and what doesn't. And that, it strikes me, is where we are now. The Cold War begins, I date the beginning of the Cold War. You can date it other places, but I date the beginning of the Cold War from Harry Truman's speech in March of 1940, Philip, 46 or 47? 47, I think, in which Harry Truman goes before a joint session of Congress and announces that it will be the policy of the United States to support countries that are attempting to resist outside interference. He never uses the word communism, but it's clear. And he proposes aid to Greece and Turkey. That's the moment when the Soviets have been pushing and pushing and pushing. That's the moment when the United States begins to push back. But what that means is that by the time Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, the country has had several decades to think through the problem. And there were people, many of them brought together by Ed Fulner at this institution, who by that stage had done a lot of hard work and reached conclusions. So I would suggest that probably we're closer to 1947 today. We're closer to the beginning than we are to the end. I also have the feeling that we won't have as much time this time around. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us all hop to it. Thank you.
So in a moment, I'll get to questions from the audience. I've got one I want to ask myself. So I remember when Reagan was asked about what's your strategy for dealing with the Soviets, he said, we win, they lose.
Absolutely.
But I want to ask about, from your observations, about three other people whom Ronald Reagan worked with very closely, obviously, that had a hand in bringing about the end of the Cold War. And that's specifically Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul, and Lech Walesa, the head of Solidarity. And I just wanted to get your take on sort of what your observations were about those relationships.
The relationship with Mrs. Thatcher was close. They were not, they're often portrayed in retrospect as a kind of buddy team. It wasn't that exactly, but Ronald Reagan enjoyed her company and respected her strength, respected her mind and respected her strength. Bill Clark once told me that Mrs. Thatcher knew how to operate, that whenever there was a meeting with the president, Bill Clark would be asked to sit in, and when Mrs. Thatcher had something critical to say, she would not address the president. She'd turn to Bill Clark and say, how can it be that the United States is doing this and this and this, when of course you should be doing this and this and this? And Bill said, and the president would look at me as if, with a twinkle in his eyes as if to say, yeah, Bill, how the hell come we know that? But that relationship, the importance of that relationship, in my judgment, cannot be overstated. These two people meet each other in London when Mrs. Thatcher has been elected head of the Tory party, but not prime minister. And Ronald Reagan is now a former governor. He's being talked about as a presidential candidate, but he's not yet. And they meet each other, and what is meant to be an informal, brief meeting lasts over an hour, as I recall. And what they discover in each other is that in different parts of the world, by completely different routes, they've reached the same conclusions. So Ronald Reagan knows he's not crazy. And Margaret Thatcher knows that there's this glamorous, handsome, cheerful, she may be a drudge, but a movie star agrees with her. The validation that this represented to the two of them, I think, is tremendously important. And they remain validators of each other's views throughout the entire period. Mrs. Thatcher also, sorry, you asked a simple question and I'm not even a third of the way through the answer, but I'll skip through the Pope, no, I'm joking about that. Mrs. Thatcher, as a geopolitical matter, geostrategic matter, the name of the game in the Cold War was Europe. If the Soviets could neutralize Germany, if they could peel Europe away from the United States, if they could introduce real dissension into the NATO alliance, that would have been very serious. And Margaret Thatcher spends all 8 years of the Reagan administration saying to the Europeans, don't you dare write him off as some American cowboy. These are sophisticated, serious people. And saying to the Americans, don't you dare write off the Europeans as effete or corrupt or decadent. Francois Mitterrand may be a socialist, but he's a serious, and she's holding this alliance together. It's underappreciated, but an act of, I don't know, kind of political heroism in my judgment. Lech Walesa and the Pope, I don't think the president admired the Pope. I never had the feeling that they understood each other well enough to develop much of a personal relationship. But General Meese would know this. I think it was somebody was seated with Ronald Reagan when the Pope made his visit to Poland in 1979, shortly after becoming Pope, and the whole country turned out to see him. And Reagan understood, all these years after imposing a communist government, communism is still utterly illegitimate. It has no support among the people whatsoever. So the Pope's moral courage, Reagan, there's somebody, Reagan so often gets written about as if he was making foreign policy calculations, as if he were in the school of Henry Kissinger, that he had a kind of calculating mind. And that's just not the way his mind worked. He had a moral imagination, and so did John Paul II. So they understood each other at that level. And of course, Lech Walesa, as far as I am aware, the president, in that meeting, there was a picture, the picture that we put up. I didn't go into this, but I'll mention it now. Josh Gilder, fellow speechwriter. One of the reasons I was so annoyed that the president just said, well, I like the line about tearing down the wall, was that Josh had said, well, Mr. President, do you have anything in particular you'd like to say to the Pope? And the president dictated, I mean, Josh was writing at top speed. The president dictated 2 or 3 pages on the importance of religious liberty and on the importance of religious renewal. And he understood that what was happening in Poland was just crucial. So Josh gets all of this new material. By the way, the PS to that is, Josh types it up, it goes to the State Department, and Josh gets a call. No, excuse, the State Department sends it back. X, 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 X. So Josh calls and says, excuse me, but would you be interested to know that the material you X'd out was dictated by the president himself? Well, excuse me, said State, but he's making a visit to John Paul II in John Paul II's capacity as a head of state, not as a religious figure, so it's totally inappropriate. And Josh just could not believe what he was hearing. And he said to the State Department official, you know, I'm sorry, I'm putting it back in. Well, let the record show that we objected.
So be it.
This was 1987. Ronald Reagan's been president for 6 years, and the State Department, okay, you get the picture.
Let's open this up. Questions? Right here. You have a microphone, so we'll make their way to you.
So the USSR had laws in some ways. They had a rule of law. What were the principles that Ronald Reagan saw about the relationship between government and the citizens that made the United States free?
Well, I mean, thank you for asking the question, because it gives me an opportunity to say, go back to the speech, which all Reagan people refer to as the speech he gave on behalf of Barry Goldwater in 1964, in which he says, I can almost quote this, Ed and I can probably, between the two of us, we could fit, but this idea that the government has no source of power but the people, the sovereign people, is still the newest and most unique idea in all the relations between a government and people. I think that's roughly the quotation. The reason I'm happy to be able to quote that is that that was all Ronald Reagan. Let it be said that although I'm a speechwriter, all we were trying to do when we wrote material for him was match what the standards he himself had established. So the other bit that often gets missed because it's icky to talk about in our current climate, he believed in God. He was a religious, he was not a regular churchgoer, but that was because his mother was a disciple of Christ. The emphasis was on the personal relationship with God. Judge Clark, Bill Clark again. They're on an airplane. Reagan is governor. They're on an airplane flying back to Washington for some reason, like National Governors Association, something. And the stewardess comes back and says, I'm sorry, we've just received word that Martin Luther King has been assassinated. So Bill Clark doesn't know what to do. And he's seated 2 or 3 rows away from Reagan. And he looks up, Reagan is praying. So it was real. That's the point. My goodness, I'm getting choked up about an event I didn't even witness.
That a time for
This is
choosing,
histrionics. Yes, sorry.
that a time for choosing speech was really
Yes, yes,
fantastic.
yes.
Other questions? Over here.
Were there any other speeches for Reagan that you're proud of that were memorable?
Everything else I wrote is totally forgettable. And I'm not entirely joking. I was the youngest member of the staff. My first couple of years, even the President of the United States has a lot of his job that's purely routine. I wrote greetings to Girl Scouts. I wrote, are you a duck hunter by any chance? Well, there's something called the Ding Darling Duck Stamp. And hunters across America have to buy a Ding Darling was a sports writer or a conservationist. I mean, I just remember it because I thought the name if I were born Ding Darling, I would change my name to Humperdinck. But you're now talking to the man who wrote the Ding Darling Duck Stamp. I wrote a couple of commutations for Thanksgiving turkeys. I wrote, actually, this I did like. I got a kick out of this. Nobody else on the speechwriting staff wanted to write the remarks that the president delivered before the Kennedy Center honors each year. And I love showbiz. This is all totally forgettable, though. And so I wrote those. I found this one, I found an anecdote about Frank Sinatra. And so I put it in, and the president, Sinatra's in the audience, and I'm standing against the wall of the East Room, listening to all this. And the president said, Francis Albert Sinatra began his singing career in Hoboken, New Jersey, singing in saloons for $5 a week. No reaction, pause. This was in the text, I anticipated it. And then the president repeats, let me repeat that. Frank Sinatra once worked for $5 a week. And the whole Hollywood crowd broke up. Afterwards, I saw Sinatra standing by himself, and I walked up and said, Mr. Sinatra, I'm a speechwriter. And he said, oh yeah? That thing about working for $5 a week, that was true. I also met Jimmy Stewart. I said, Mr. Stewart, I'm a speechwriter. And Jimmy Stewart said, oh. And then his wife came and took him away. So there you have the annals of my speechwriting career.
Famous speech among duck hunters, though, I'm sure.
Yes,
We got
yes.
it right over here.
Well, I'm pitching
Hang on,
myself.
let's grab the microphone.
I watch the Tear Down This Wall speech monthly, so seeing you is just fabulous.
Could you put $1 in the mail? I get no royalties on this stuff.
So you mentioned Truman as the first president who brought to life
The Cold War, right.
Cold War.
Yes.
Do you think FDR was a closet communist?
No. But FDR is extremely difficult to read. He is extremely difficult to read. On the pro-FDR column, we lost fewer than 500,000 men during the Second World War, killed. The Soviets lost 20 million. Whatever it was that he did, he caused the Soviets to bear the brunt. So there's that to be said. On the other hand, we have statement after statement after statement. I think in particular his comment to Bullitt was the diplomat, all right, and FDR is preparing to go to Yalta, and he says, again, this is a close paraphrase, I think if I give Stalin everything he wants and ask nothing in return, then he'll be very cooperative with us in the noblesse oblige. FDR uses the phrase noblesse oblige, as if Stalin went to Groton and Harvard the way he did. Then I believe that he'll cooperate with us after the war. There is also a very striking passage, Harry Hopkins, to one of FDR's speechwriters. This is after FDR is dead, and about 18 months before Harry Hopkins, who had stomach cancer and knew he was dying, himself died. So he had no reason to lie about this. And there's Harry Hopkins is quoted as saying, again, this is a close paraphrase, neither the president nor any one of us had any doubt that the Soviet Union would prove cooperative after the war. Our only fear was that Stalin might die because we weren't sure about who might replace him. So the level of naivete is on record, is staggering, and it's on record again and again and again. Or we see, I'm sorry, if I get going on this one, I'll go. Stalin, there's a moment as the war is coming to an end where we have, Philip Hughes, who's seated right here, will know the history better than I, but we attempt, the Germans who were in Italy wanted to surrender to us and wrap up the Italian part of the war in a hurry. And we engaged in talks with them. Nothing came of it. But word of this reached Stalin, and he sent scorchers of cables to Churchill and FDR, accusing us of seeking a separate peace, of trying to cut a deal with the Nazis that left him out. And what you see is the shock among FDR. FDR is writing a cable to Stalin to calm him down the day FDR dies. It's the last thing he's writing. Now, why would you be shocked that Joseph Stalin would suspect you of a separate peace, and trying to negotiate a separate peace, when Stalin had entered into an agreement with Hitler, and the Stalin, in other words, you just see so many instances of real naivete that it's impossible, in my opinion, to exclude the conclusion that Americans yet again were guilty of wishful thinking. They wanted Stalin to be the man they wanted him to be. And part of the heroism, in my judgment, of that plucky, tough little son of a bitch, Harry Truman, is that when he becomes president, he has been led to believe nothing except that Stalin is cooperative. And he wants to do nothing but continue the policies of FDR. And Harry Truman, who himself said over and over again, there are 200 men in this town who could do this job better than I do, but I'm the one who has to do it. Harry Truman had to recognize that the sainted FDR was mistaken about Stalin, that Stalin is violating all his agreements at Yalta, and Harry Truman had to be the one who stood up to Stalin. So there, I don't know. I guess my theme here is, one of the reasons I love journalism is that it's such a wonderful hedge against reality. The world may be going to hell, but what a story. The more one reads American history, the more one recognizes that this country has again and again and again been a very close run thing. And now we're in it again. And I guess I'd say that, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. Just shut me down.
It's good stuff.
When Ronald Reagan delivered this line, he didn't know the wall would fall. In fact, he gave an interview after the wall came down that said he never expected it to happen. Ed didn't know things were going to turn around when he founded this place in 1973. They didn't know they would win. They did it because it was right, because they felt it was their duty. And now we're in the same pickle. Fortunately, I'm over 37, and it's not my job anymore.
We have time for
You
one
young
more.
guys, it's
We have
up to
time for
you.
one more question. Let's go over here.
Way in the corner?
Way in the back.
Thank you for coming and speaking tonight. You mentioned at the end that we are closer to the time of Truman announcing we are going to push back than Reagan saying we're going to tear down. And you also said that we
Feels that way to me. I couldn't prove it.
feels like that, yes. But you also mentioned that it feels like we have less time. What are the ways that this conflict that we're in is different, and how do you think we should respond differently?
Well, I'm very sorry to tell you, because you look as though you're among the under 37s, that it seems to me that in all kinds of ways you're in a worse pickle than we were in. China's bigger than we are. You may have noticed that. They already have an economy big enough so that they can spend anything on the military they want to. They can match us and outspend us. Our only sustainable advantage over them, in my judgment, is our ability to innovate. Particularly now we have defense tech startups across this is good news in my opinion. But the ability to innovate doesn't cut you very much slack if 10 seconds after you innovate, the code is transferred to Beijing. Problem one. Problem two. AI is coming along. The Chinese are already using it to impose a surveillance state of the kind that Beria could only have dreamt of, and it's real. Item three, this country, although I am hoping that the next election settles things in our favor for some time to come. Lord, I'm hoping we can avoid another squeaker, but who knows what is coming. But this country, there are all kinds of fights that we have to fight that wouldn't even have computed 40 years ago when General Meese and I were in the White House. If you had pulled us aside and said, 40 years from now, people are going to have to fight to persuade the public that boys shouldn't compete in women's sports. What are you talking about, would have been our answer. Or Ronald Reagan signs immigration legislation in 1986. He grants amnesty to about 2.8 million people who were here, who'd been here since 1980. That was part of the stipulation. But the piece of the legislation that often gets overlooked, there was a second half of that legislation, and it involved very rigorous enforcement mechanisms to ensure that illegal immigration stopped from then on. 9 million or so people entering the country illegally during this administration, we wouldn't even have known what to make of that. There was a sort of moral and cultural capital that we were still able to take for granted. The family divorce was high in the 1980s. We'd suffered that, but at least the intact family remained an ideal. It was something that the society recognized as worth encouraging and applauding. To an astonishing extent, that's just gone. So it seems to me that there are arguments that need to be made that we didn't need to make 40 years ago. If I were you, I'd just move to Mexico right now. Okay, hold on. Before I talk myself, I'm going to have a drink, but the way I'm going now, it won't stop with one. Okay, so consider this. We still have, as messed up as they are, and believe me, we still have the greatest universities in the world, as measured by, anybody care to go study anyplace else? The number of students, okay, so we have the greatest universities in the world. We have incomparably the richest, most diverse, most dynamic economy. We have incomparably the most dynamic and innovative tech sector. We have, divided as we are, we have the only successful democracy in the history of humankind that is based upon a creed rather than racial or ethnic identity. So actually don't move to Mexico. Double down. Double down on this country. But do your work. Your generation will have fights. All right, now I've talked myself into a corner. There's nowhere to go.
No, you're great. I can't think, frankly, of a better way to kick off this lecture series. That was truly wonderful. Please join me.
I thought you were about to say, kick me off the stage.
Thank you. That was terrific. It was great.